Crime Squad listeners. Welcome back to this week's episode of Crime Squad Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Natasha, coming at you from London, Ontario. Crime Squad episodes are released bi-weekly on Fridays, just in time for your weekend. Or I guess you should say the classic weekend, because I know from experience not everyone has the same days off. Crime Squad focuses on Canadian true crime stories, both solved and unsolved. I try to cover cases that aren't as well known as certain others, especially historical cases that even I, as a crime buff, haven't heard of before. If you like the way I research and deliver this material, please join the squad and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of my bi-weekly uploads. This episode is going to be a continuation of The Boogeyman is Real. If you're tuning in for the first time, I recommend you stop and go back to part 1 of this episode so you get some backstory. I'm sure you've noticed that I haven't identified the person responsible for these violent acts. I refer instead to him as the man or the boogeyman. This is because I want to focus on the victims instead of the man behind the crime. I will reveal the culprit later on in the episode after we've gone over the victims and their stories in as much detail as possible. A lot of the time, the media sensationalizes the criminals without a lot of focus on the victims. This is why my approach for this episode is different. Okay, squad, let's get into part 2 of The Boogeyman is Real. We're back in beautiful British Columbia in May of 1981. So far, in a period of only 6 months, 3 children have gone missing and were later determined to have been murdered. The man behind these horrific acts seems to be escalating. The first victim, Christine Weller, was murdered in November 1980. The second, Colleen Dagnall, was murdered April 16, 1981. And Darren Johnsrud's life was ended on the 22nd of April. The time between these murders was shortening significantly, and unfortunately, there was much more to come. Last episode, we ended with foreshadowing that a teenage hitchhiker's life would be forever altered on May 2nd, 1981. On this day, the boogeyman had rented a large U-Haul-style truck, which he was using to move his family to a larger apartment. After all, his wife had just given birth to their son, and they needed bigger accommodations. On that same day, May 2nd, 16-year-old Verna Bjerke was in Hope, British Columbia. She was planning to hitchhike to Kamloops, around 200 kilometers away from Hope, to see her boyfriend. Unfortunately, Verna never quite made it. She's been classified as a missing person ever since. 5 months after she vanished without a trace, some of her belongings were found just outside the town of Hope, along a highway called Highway 7. It is believed Verna is a victim of the boogeyman, although this can't officially be confirmed. The boogeyman did claim, however, to have taken part in the murder of Verna and indicated he'd helped to dispose of her body. If you know anything about the disappearance of Verna Bjerke, please contact the Chilliwack RCMP at local number 604-792-4611. There isn't a case number to reference, but you can use Verna's name. So, again, the boogeyman seemed to be escalating. He had murdered multiple children between November 1980 and the beginning of May 1981, all while his girlfriend was pregnant and then gave birth to their son. The man decided it was time to make an honest woman of his girlfriend, and so they were married on May 15th, 1981. 4 days later, on May 19th, he was hungry for violence. He drove to a local liquor store and purchased a case of cold beer and a 26-ounce bottle of Canadian Club rye whiskey. In parallel, 16-year-old Sandra Wolfsteiner decided she would bring her 22-year-old boyfriend, Keith, lunch. He was working after all, so it might be nice to take his lunch to him and spend his break together. She had been staying with her boyfriend and his mother in Surrey, BC. The boyfriend's mother watched Sandra leave the house and walk out to the highway at around 10:30 a.m. that morning, and just as quickly watched Sandra get into a gray vehicle. That was the last time she was seen. Not much is known about Sandra and her life, but what I do know is she was born September 23rd, 1964, in Prince George, British Columbia. She liked horses. They were her most treasured hobby. She had a large family with living grandparents, 2 stepsisters, a stepbrother, a sister, a brother, her mother, father, and a stepmother. The only photo of Sandra I was able to find is a headshot showing a pale-faced, dark-eyed beauty. She has a full bottom lip with the top being slightly thinner, but it could also be the tight-lipped smile she's giving to the camera. Her eyes are large and dark-colored in the picture. However, in a later recollection by the man, he said her eyes were green. Her eyebrows are hidden by a thick curtain of bangs. Sandra was going to hitchhike to her boyfriend's work location, and very quickly after she embarked on the journey, she was noticed by the man. He pulled over, asked where she was going, and wouldn't you know it, he said he was going there too. Sandra eagerly got in the vehicle, and instantly the man began his same old spiel. Did Sandra want a job washing windows and shampooing rugs at $10 per hour for his construction company? Sandra had mentioned she very much needed a job and wanted to get her own apartment, so the man also used this to his advantage. He offered her an apartment for $135 a month, fully furnished. He told her the going rate was usually $580, but he'd give her a discount. Sandra seemed wary and questioned the man on why he'd do such a thing. But the man always had an answer, and he said it would be the best thing because she would be working for him and he'd give her a place to stay. The only rule was that he didn't want any live-in boyfriends. According to what the man later told police when he confessed, he told Sandra the apartment was furnished with over $10,000 worth of furniture and also had a tennis court and whirlpool. He said Sandra could move in that very weekend, and she was elated. She wanted to be able to buy a car instead of hitchhiking all the time. The man then said he would be happy to help her get a car, which she could get cheaply. Poor Sandra, so naive. Or maybe just the right amount of naive for a 16-year-old girl. She told the man she had $1,000 in the bank and asked if that would be enough for a car. The man told her he'd take her to the bank so she could withdraw the money, and he'd take it and he'd get her a good deal. They stopped at the bank, and the man wanted to make sure the deal was fully solidified and the money would be his. After all, he knew he wasn't going to let Sandra live. He just wanted the money. He told Sandra he'd talked to her parents about the job he'd offered her, and that he wanted to take her out to dinner at a fancy restaurant with his wife that night. He tried to reassure Sandra he meant no harm by telling her again and again how much he loved his wife. After they were finished at the bank, the man offered Sandra a cold beer in celebration. He also gave her 2 of his famous little pills, pretending to take them himself like he always did. The man drove to a lake near Chilliwack, BC, approximately 50 kilometers from where Sandra was headed. She was now drunk and drowsy and mostly incoherent. He explained he had to pick up tools from a remote cabin and turned onto a remote logging road. He definitely seemed to know a lot of these roads. He had Sandra get out of the car and start walking toward this supposed cabin he was looking for. Squad, this is the first trigger warning of the episode. The following will contain details of violence and assault and may not be for all listeners. If you want to skip ahead about 1 minute and 10 seconds. At this point, the man was well versed with a hammer, and he tucked one discreetly into the waistband of his pants. He followed behind Sandra, then suddenly raised it and drove it into the back of her head. Sandra fell down and rolled onto her back. She looked at the man and called him a bastard before closing her eyes. The man then unleashed his inhumane torture tactics on Sandra, hitting her again and again and again with the hammer. Soon, she was no longer moving, but she was still breathing. The man did what he always did with his victims. He brutally raped and sodomized Sandra repeatedly. When he was done, he covered her with branches and leaves. She was still breathing, but not enough for him to worry that she would survive. The man went back to his car to raid Sandra's purse for the $1,000 she'd withdrawn from the bank, and when he found out she only had $15 and had lied to him, he was satisfied with everything he'd done to her. He felt justified in his actions. He drove to Coquitlam, washed the interior and exterior of his car, and went on about his day. Meanwhile, Keith, Sandra's boyfriend, was worried. She hadn't shown up for lunch, and it was very unlike her to stand him up. He called his mother, who said that Sandra had left earlier that morning. Keith called police immediately, but was told he couldn't file a missing persons report until at least 48 hours had passed. When Keith again tried to report Sandra missing, police considered him a suspect in her disappearance, which is when Keith willingly took a lie detector test. He passed the test, but instead of pursuing an investigation into the whereabouts of Sandra, the police assumed Sandra had disappeared because she wanted to leave. Sandra's body could never be confirmed as being found. The man did eventually lead police to the location he claimed he'd left her, but the remains that were found near that area were so badly decomposed, and there wasn't a lot left due to animal activity. In either case, the family claimed it to be Sandra and had her cremated so they could have a funeral service for her. So I'm literally sitting here and thinking, how can all of this be happening and nobody in BC is putting the pieces together that there's a very disturbed individual at the center of all of this? The man, of course, would continue to escalate, seemingly becoming arrogant with the fact that he'd not yet been caught or questioned regarding any of the missing children. And with cockiness comes recklessness. On July 21st, a sunny Sunday in Coquitlam, where the man, his wife, and their infant son lived, he was again in the mood to kill. He saw a young girl making her way to a nearby bus stop. He rolled down his window and offered her the same job he always used to ply local youth. She apologized and said she actually lived in Burnaby, a town close to Coquitlam. Well, what a coincidence! That's where the man said he was headed also. But we all know the tragic end to this tale. The little girl should have known better, but in 1981, small-town British Columbia, maybe she didn't. Maybe kids just weren't taught the same as I was in the 90s about stranger danger and the terrible people that live in the world. Yet again, the man provided beer and those magic pills that were supposed to prevent you from feeling drunk, but would actually knock you flat on your ass as a powerful sedative. What followed was exactly what followed for each and every other victim of the man's sick, sadistic impulses: violent sexual assault and murder. Ada Anita Court was a happy 13-year-old girl. She lived in Burnaby, BC, with her mother and stepfather. She was a good kid and was popular at school. The head teacher at the middle school Ada attended, called Cascade Heights, said that Ada always had a bright smile on her face and that, quote, to know her was to love her, end quote. Ada was always thinking of others. As an example, a teacher recalled that on the last day of school after a party, Ada offered to go home to quickly change, then make her way back to school to ensure one of the younger children got home safely. The reason Ada was in Coquitlam on the weekend of June 19th was because she was babysitting overnight on Saturday, June 20th for her brother. She stayed overnight to babysit her two nieces. Ada had a good home life, and although sometimes there was a bit of friction with her stepfather, she'd have no reason to simply run away. The only photograph I have found of Ada is grainy at best. It cuts off most of her hair and shows only the face of a girl with a wide smile. 2 months after Ada's disappearance, searchers found a skull missing the lower jawbone near a lake close to where Ada's life had been tragically taken. Through dental records, it was revealed it was, in fact, Ada Anita Court. It took until late July of 1981 for police to realize that something very sinister was happening in lower mainland BC. A predator was on the loose, and BC's beloved children were going missing at an alarming pace. The Boogeyman was beginning to be very, very real. Things continued to escalate and continued to escalate rapidly. Little Simon Partington, at the age of 9, was riding his bicycle on July 2nd, 1981. He had just left his home, and it was midday, but unfortunately, the man was hungry, this time for lunch. He had left an odd job he was doing to buy some burgers and beer, but when he saw Simon, it unlocked a different kind of hunger inside him. Simon had just finished a bowl of cornflakes, a typical breakfast he ate daily. He had a new Snoopy book, and he packed that up. He was going to a friend's house that day and wanted to bring it along. Simon has been described as being small and angelic, with the face of a cherub. Originally born in England, he was living in Surrey, BC, with his mother and father. Simon made a fatal mistake when he got into the man's car. He was wary. He said he wasn't supposed to drink, and while he was interested in a summer job, he knew well enough that he'd have to ask his mother, which he told the man. The man, though, knew these kind of objections well, and he said he'd talk to Simon's mother on his behalf. They drove to a corner store where the man bought some candy. He gave Simon one of the sedatives, telling the boy it wouldn't make him drunk if he drank a beer and also had the pill. This time, maybe because of the time of day or the lack of options, the man drove to a spot directly across from where he'd killed and left Christine Weller's body. And this piece of shit child killer did it yet again. He sexually assaulted young Simon. Simon, who at 9 years old was the youngest victim of this killer. Then he strangled him. He left Simon where he lay, got rid of his clothes, and continued on with his day. Simon's disappearance was taken very seriously from the get-go. First of all, there was the age. He was quite young. Second of all, from all the missing children to this point in the timeline, Simon could be considered the most well-adjusted and least likely to have been a runaway. His parents were middle class, and he didn't come from a broken family. He wasn't a bad kid by any means. People were starting to whisper and wonder what was happening. People were beginning to put the puzzle pieces together. All these missing children, could they possibly be linked? Over 100 people turned up to help search for Simon within just hours of his disappearance. For Simon, there was no "you must wait 48 hours." Police hadn't yet linked the crimes because the modus operandi kept changing. Sometimes the man stabbed his victims, sometimes he strangled them, sometimes he used a hammer. The children were of varying ages and genders and came from very different backgrounds. The man thought he was safe, and he wanted more. Judy Kozma would be the beginning of the end for this evil man. On July 9th, just a week after Simon Partington was kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered, the man was cruising again when he came across what he thought of as a shapely teenager at a phone booth. Gag. He pulled over to talk to her, but before he could, she peered into the window and addressed the man by name. He was a little shocked and tried to think very quickly about how he might know this girl. She revealed the answer, though, when she told him that a few months ago he'd seen her and offered her a job. He had told her he would pick her up at her home and pay her, you guessed it, $10 an hour. Except he never showed. And he'd also forgotten that actually he'd written down Judy Kozma's name and address in a notebook of his. This little detail would be the loose thread that would eventually help to unravel everything. The man said the job was still Judy's if she wanted it. This is the part of the story where you just want to scream, "No, Judy, don't! You won't make it back alive. You were lucky the first time when he didn't come get you. Stay far away." But Judy can't hear you. Judy is stuck forever in 1981 because she got in the car. She drank the beer. She took the pills. And 14-year-old Judy Kozma would be assaulted and killed, albeit killed differently to his last victims. He went back to the days of Christine Weller and he brutally stabbed Judy Kozma to death. Judy was only 14 years old. She was originally born in Quebec, but at some point the family moved to beautiful British Columbia. On July 25th, 4 teenagers were camping near Weaver Lake. One of them decided to go exploring and noticed a peculiar smell. The smell worsened significantly as they walked towards something slightly covered by leaves and other debris. It only took a few moments to register that this was a human body in an advanced state of decay. Police were called, and the body would be identified as Judy Kozma. Not a runaway, but the victim of a depraved murderer with sexual elements. Just 2 weeks after Judy Kozma was murdered, on July 23rd, 1981, fate was sealed for Raymond King II, a 15-year-old boy who was looking for work for the summer. A chance meeting between himself and this evil man would lead to booze and sedatives in the car, and then, just like the other 7 before him, he would be brutally sexually assaulted. The man seemed to be visiting familiar territory. This time, he took Raymond to the same place he had killed Judy Kozma and Ada Court, both still undiscovered at this time. Squad, this murder is a little bit different than the others, so again, and I hate that I even have to say this because honestly, researching this episode has been really, really hard, and seeing how many children this monster killed is heartbreaking. But the following will describe violence leading to murder. If you want to skip ahead approximately 65 seconds. For some reason or another, the man was experimenting again. He wanted to inflict a different kind of wound on Raymond. But it wasn't because of who it was. It could have been anyone. It was just this next victim was the unfortunate one. I'm going to bypass the graphic descriptions of the horrific sexual assault against Raymond and fast forward to the poor boy laying on the blanket the man had set in the grass. The man took a 3-inch nail and placed it at the crown of Raymond's head. He used his hammer to knock it flush against Raymond's skull, then threw the boy off the edge of the gully. Raymond was still alive, but only semi-conscious. The man then threw large, heavy rocks onto Raymond's face and head, hoping they would kill him. He also threw branches and other debris in an effort to cover up the body. Only 2 days after Raymond King II met his untimely end, the Boogeyman was awakened yet again. Sigrun Arndt was a pretty 18-year-old girl from Germany. She had long brownish hair and wore a pair of round-frame glasses. She has a somewhat pointed nose, large eyes, and wide smiling lips. Her mother, Irmgard, recalls her as an intelligent and suspicious person who would openly talk about the danger of strangers and who would never even dream of hitchhiking. Sigrun was excited to be in Canada as a tourist. Her visit was to last approximately 3 weeks. She was traveling with some friends from Germany, but she broke away on one of the days to go visit a cousin who happened to live in British Columbia. Sigrun reportedly got herself to Coquitlam to visit the cousin, but was disappointed to realize her cousin wasn't home. She wasn't sure of her next move, but the Boogeyman had already set sights on her. He asked Sigrun if she needed a ride, and although she was always a cautious girl, she led her defenses down and accepted the ride from Coquitlam back to where she was staying in Burnaby. In the car, the man spoke to her about his wife and child, putting Sigrun even more at ease. He took her to a pub for some beers, where he purchased several pitchers and they both drank. After they'd had a few pitchers of beer, they got into the man's car, where he quickly added 3 of the sedative pills he was so fond of to an open beer and handed the can to Sigrun. According to the man, based on his later account of this incident, Sigrun didn't want the extra beer, but he plied her into it by saying it was a Canadian custom. Sigrun, who was having such a wonderful time in Canada and loved getting to know Canadians and their customs, willingly agreed. Soon, though, she was telling the man she wasn't feeling okay. The pills had begun to sedate her. Sigrun Arnd was murdered and assaulted just like the other 8 children before her. Her body was found and identified, and her parents were called long distance in Germany on August 28th. They were rightfully devastated. Simon Partington's body had been found in close proximity just a week before Sigrun was found. Police were still scratching their heads, but were narrowing in on a potential person of interest. Just 2 days later, Terry Lynn Carson, aged 15, was waiting at a bus stop in Surrey. She was on her way to a pet shop to apply for a job. She came across the man instead, the man who had just committed 2 murders in 4 days. The man who had already killed 9 children between the ages of 9 and 18 years old. The same old spiel occurred. The booze, the pills, the drive to the remote location, the multiple sexual assaults, the horrific murder. This time, there was a screwdriver and a hammer involved. And after a brutal attack, Terry Lynn was still breathing. The man then placed Terry Lynn's body face down in a shallow creek about a foot in depth. He stood on her back until she drowned and left her body there. Terry Lynn's mother reported her missing to the police the morning after on July 28th. Police were still skeptical despite all the other disappearances. Eventually, though, they did put out a bulletin seeking assistance. It listed Terry Lynn's age, which again was 15, her height, which was 5 foot 2 inches, her weight, which was 117 pounds, as well as hair color, eye color, and distinguishing clothing, which respectively was blonde, brown, and she wore glasses. Terry Lynn's mother had missing persons posters printed, which she distributed in the community. On the poster, she had written a plea for someone to please call her with any information. No calls ever came in. On August 27th, it became apparent Terry Lynn wouldn't be coming home. Her body was found in Hope, BC, in a shallow creek. Louise Chartrand knew the jig was up. She was a 17-year-old waitress who, on July 30th, got to her job at a local diner approximately 2 hours earlier than the start of her shift. This would seal her fate, because the man would be out cruising and he'd wind up with Louise in his car because of yet another discussion about a potential job. Louise was different than the other children. She seemed to sense something in the man that she didn't like, something that made her wary. She accepted the booze and the pills the man produced, but by the time they arrived about 112 kilometers north of Vancouver at an old abandoned gravel pit, Louise seemed to know what was going to happen to her. She kept accusing the man of the fact that he was going to kill her, to which he constantly denied. He then forced himself on her, but she couldn't fight him off because of the sedative. The thing is, though, she kept saying, "You're going to kill me, aren't you?" The man was infuriated with her for suggesting this, even though he knew damn well that's exactly what he was going to do. Within an hour of that initial accusation, Louise Chartrand was lying under a cover of sticks and brush, breathing shallowly but certainly not going to live after the damage that was inflicted upon her by the man. Louise would be the last known victim before that man was arrested, and that man was Clifford Olson. Clifford Olson was born January of 1940. He was a career criminal who had spent many years in jail cumulatively over the years. He was a violent, sadistic sexual predator who enjoyed sex with children. He was accused multiple times of molesting his infant nieces, but he always managed to weasel his way out of these accusations and avoid being arrested and convicted for that particular crime. The crimes he was convicted of were mostly related to him being a con artist of sorts. There were a lot of burglary arrests, mostly. He started his killing spree in British Columbia, his native province, in 1980 with Christine Weller, and over a period of 8 months and 19 days, he killed another 10 children. How did police in British Columbia finally get on to Clifford Olson? During his murderous spree, Olson had attempted to sexually assault a girl named Sarah he'd picked up at an arcade. She was tough and basically told him to get lost, and she later went to police to report his advances on her. Although Olson was questioned and let go due to lack of evidence, the officer who investigated had an uneasy feeling. He looked into Olson and didn't like his past criminal activity or the numerous accusations against him over the years. He shared his concerns with fellow officers who didn't seem overly concerned or interested. But still, eventually they were authorized to conduct surveillance on Olson. They followed him everywhere, and unbeknownst to the officers, they were actually tailing him on nights he committed 2 of the 11 child murders. The police had stopped tailing him for the evening for whatever reason. One noted was budget issues. By August 7th, Olson was under constant police surveillance. On August 12th, police noted that Olson picked up 2 hitchhikers, teenage girls, and they were hoping to catch him red-handed, but also wanted to avoid these girls from getting hurt. At one point in the night, Olson pulled off the road he was driving on with the 2 girls in tow, and he pulled into the woods. The officers felt this was the time to act and arrest, but when they ambushed the trio, they were simply partying and drinking. They arrested Olson anyway and charged him with contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Later on, during an interview, Olson admitted those girls were as good as dead, and if he hadn't been arrested that night, they would have been added to the toll. In custody, Olson was questioned relentlessly, and he never once lost composure until finally, after hours and hours and hours and days of questioning, he admitted he knew about the missing children and where they were because his friend told him. In one of the most controversial acts in all of Canadian history, Olson offered to reveal the bodies of the victims as long as the RCMP paid him $10,000 per body, which would be given to his wife Joan and their son. He even had the audacity to say he would consider one of the 11 bodies a freebie, and he would only charge the RCMP for 10 reveals. The RCMP, for its own reasons, made good on this deal. And that was how many of the bodies that hadn't been found yet would be located, with an admittance of guilt from Olson. By January of 1982, Olson pled guilty to 11 murders and was sentenced to 11 concurrent life sentences. He was imprisoned in Quebec's super-maximum prison, Saint-Anne-de-Plain. Canada had just abolished capital punishment in 1976, but Olson's case sparked great debate on whether or not the death penalty should be considered for his heinous crimes. Ultimately, he was remanded to prison, where he died in 2011 at the age of 71 after a terminal cancer diagnosis. In a book about Clifford Olson's disgusting crimes, the author captured what reportedly happened to Olson in prison as he awaited his court date scheduled for January 1981. He was not granted bail and had to bide his time in jail between his arrest and court date. Reportedly, he was kept in segregation, and the guards made it known how they really felt about him. Olson reported guards would spit on him, punch him, and otherwise abuse him. Though he filed complaints, nothing was done to stop the behavior. Apparently, other prisoners were encouraged to throw cups of urine on him when they could, and were also told by the guards that if they beat or threatened Olson, the guards would look the other way. When Olson received a new shirt, he looked it over and realized somebody had actually written "baby fucker" on the back. I can't say I disagree with any of that behavior, especially considering Olson scored in the top percentile of the psychopath test administered by psychologists when he was in prison. I haven't even included some of the most graphic violence that Olson issued upon the 11 victims that died at his hand. And believe me, the real facts are not for the faint of heart. As many of you know, I'm currently expecting a child, and this story was extremely difficult for me. All I kept thinking about was obviously my existing son and the son I'm growing inside me, and what I would do to a person like Clifford Olson if they ever hurt my child. Don't fuck with this mama bear is what I have to say to that. The other piece of this is the fact that it takes a person 9 months to grow an infant. And in as many months, Clifford Olson killed 11 children. I'll leave you with that. All right, squad, so that's going to do it for this week's episode. And I won't lie, I am glad to be done with that one. What do you think about the death penalty for criminals like Clifford Olson? Yay or nay? If you like the way I research and write these episodes, please consider subscribing to my podcast. A rating wouldn't hurt either. Coming up in 2 weeks' time, I will release another installment of The Devil's Playground, a series on the Elgin Middlesex Detention Center and the 20 inmate deaths that have occurred there since 2009. Stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, stay safe and be kind to each other. Huh.